2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Time to have a look at all things happening in the world of politics, and it's not very often we say this to our Professor of Politics, Jim Jost, but can you get me a deal? Maybe on a holiday, a new car. That's fine for everyone in the real world, but those at the top of the tree in politics need to be a little bit removed from that, or so it would seem.
Yeah. Good morning, Mark. Yeah, it's often the case that politicians get offers from various quarters to, a cheap deal here, a cheap deal there, and we saw one recently last week with Mathias Cormann, the Minister for Finance, getting cheap airfares through a friendship. And for most people, in most circumstances, this wouldn't be a huge deal.
It wouldn't be, would it? Because, if you wanted to go, overseas on a holiday or wherever, and you knew somebody that worked in such a place, and they said, look, well, if you get it with me, we'll knock 20% off or whatever, that's just good for you. Yeah,
but in this particular case, we're talking about a Minister of the Crown, in particular the Minister for Finance, and there's not a suggestion that he necessarily did the wrong thing or acted
illegally, for sure.
Yeah. But in terms of the look and the politics involved, given that the person that assisted him, gave him the deal, was the CEO of the company, who's also connected to the Liberal Party as well, makes it a little more complicated, and it means that the minister isn't able to sort of stand up and set an example, as it were, because there are questions that one could levy here. So in terms of, has he done the wrong thing legally? Well, probably not, but has he done the wrong thing in the sense of undermining his own credibility and standing and example setting? In terms of how ministers should conduct themselves, this is I think, the political question. And although it doesn't necessarily, as far as I can work out, there is no agreed code of conduct since John Howard's code of conduct was enacted since he as Prime Minister back in 1996 drew one up. Nevertheless, and Kevin Rudd followed up with another one. It's not clear that Mr. Cormann would necessarily have breached that in any technical sense, but in the spirit of how we expect our politicians to act, he probably did. And, ministerial accountability and responsibility is, a sort of complicated thing. The ministers are accountable to the Parliament. That's one of the principles of our Westminster system. And the idea of them being accountable is that the Parliament controls their conduct, and in the sense of, or making judgments about their conduct. Of course, the lower house of the Parliament is usually controlled by the government of the day. Right at the present time, though, the government of the day is in a minority. But basically, ministerial responsibility means that the ministers are responsible to the Parliament for the way in which they conduct their business.
It might not be illegal, it might not be technically against any of the rules, but you would have to think it's probably a dumb thing to do, because you know very well that as soon as those on the other side of the house get a bit of a sniff of it, they're bringing it up, and probably at the most inopportune time is when they'll do it.
Well, given where we're at the moment, federally speaking, in terms of heading into an election in less than 3 months, you would think that senior politicians in particular would be very careful about how their actions might be perceived. Because, when you're a politician, particularly a senior one, and particularly in government, the perception of how you behave is often more important than the reality of what you've actually done.
That's true.
In many cases, we find that politicians are perceived to be acting in a particular way, and we get that perception hammered into us via various media sources for particular political purposes. And then when the dust clears, we find that they haven't done anything wrong at all. It's just appeared a little funny or dodgy. But when all is said and done, we find that nothing's really gone on. And this applies across the board. It's not just simply for government
By then,
members.
now it's out there, and enough people have got in their mind that you are dodgy, even though you probably weren't.
Well,
in
exactly,
a
Mark.
thinking.
In the current context, it's really important at present for senior members of both political parties, of all political parties, to be seen to be doing the right thing. If they're coming up into this election cycle, they certainly don't want to be seen as somehow or other not doing the right thing. And we've had, particularly in the government, a number of cases recently where ministers perhaps need to be far more vigilant and diligent. And certainly within the past sort of 3 months in the Morrison government, we've seen actions by ministers that do seem to be somewhat less responsible than one would perhaps expect and require.
And hopefully those on all sides, hopefully the captains of their teams are making sure they are on the straight and narrow with this, because with an election around the corner, we don't want all of the oxygen to be on this really frivolous stuff. We want that time to be talking about what their plans are if they retain or get into government. That's what we really want to talk about.
Well, Mark, from a voter's perspective, yes.
Yeah.
We would like to see the focus on the issues that matter, on the particular policies that the government and a would-be government, as in the case of the opposition, might be thinking of bringing to bear. We would like to see some focus on how they expect to be able to fund the particular proposals, how they expect to roll them out, what sort of time frame, and whether the promises actually have any substance underneath. What voters don't want and would like to see less of is the froth and bubble, smoke and mirrors stuff. And to some extent, a large extent, I would suggest, they're less interested in the smear tactics and more interested in the reality. And it's unfortunate, of course, but it's part of politics that political parties will resort to various tactics that are not so savoury in order to gain some form of electoral advantage.
Again, hopefully they can all get back on track so that the voters at least get a fair crack at this with the federal election later in the year. Jim, as always, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And we have the state election in 3 weeks. So
we do. We'll be ramping up on state issues very shortly. Our Professor of Politics, Jim Jose, on 2NURFM 103.7.